Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Carbonethic YouTube channel. Today, I have the pleasure to meet actually with my CEO at Carbonethic, Mr. Brent Tolmie. Hi, Brent. How are you?
Good, Martin. How are you this morning?
I'm good as well. We had some electricity issue at home, but now everything is resolved, so we can push forward for the video today. So, Brent, first, we want to talk about the forest in the next few weeks and give a pretty good idea of what's going on in Canada. But before we go there, that would be interesting that the people get to know you properly. So, what's your background? Before we talk about the company and the forest situation, what's your background? Where are you coming from? So that the people can understand and enjoy actually the expertise and the knowledge that you bring to Carbonethic company.
Sure. Well, thanks again for having me. I always enjoy our fireside talks. And my background is fourth generation in the woods. So my family's been involved in various levels of forestry, whether that's working on the rail yards with logs or felling timber, commercial sales, sawmilling, full-scale forest management, different things like that. So my dad was a logger, his dad was a logger, and his dad was a logger, and recognized that probably earlier on that we worked in a sustainable industry, and I was proud of that. I was also proud of the fact that we made products that people actually used. And when you think about the economy, when you log a tree and it gets cut into a sawmill product and it goes into a house, or it goes into newsprint, or it goes into formworks or things of that nature, you're proud because it's gone to an end use, becomes a table or furniture, things of that nature. So to see the connection between what my hands were doing and how that product ended up benefiting people in their lives, and then learned the business part of it overall. So I spent many years up until about 2000, and then got on the management side of things. My family bought a forest license, and what that means is they had the right to manage a parcel of land owned by the government, but we had the right to develop that timber, and for that we would pay a royalty fee to the government based on what we extracted. And that was eye-opening because we went from being contract loggers, i.e. here's a parcel, cut it down, process it, get it to the mill as quickly and efficiently as possible, to all of a sudden being in charge of our own development and learning about silviculture, learning about obviously road construction, bridge maintenance, all those different components where perhaps we'd done the construction before, but we didn't have to maintain a network of hundreds of kilometers of resource roads. We didn't have to deactivate the roads necessarily. We didn't have to think about what happens if there's a big rain event in October and are going out doing bridge inspections, for instance, to make sure that all the areas that we're responsible for are accessible. And then also having tens of thousands of hectares or at least thousands of hectares tied up, making sure that those trees are getting back, going from a seedling that we planted into healthy, productive forest, and managing that side of the business. So that for me was eye-opening. Of course, I'm an entrepreneur. So in 2004, I left the family business, went out on my own and started sorting logs. And what that means is they come in on the truck. We would process them into different packages for the various mills. So that whether that was heading to be plywood, if it was going to Japan to get into to cut into timbers for temples, whether it was going to Asia for inexpensive packaging and to support the likes of the Amazons of the world or shipping industries, or if it was going into high-end guitar wood. We sold to probably 150 different customers in dozens of jurisdictions around the planet, as well as a lot of the domestic mills. So that was great for me. And then, of course, being an entrepreneur, I broke into the hydropower industry because of keen energy and where our power comes from, and was able to support hydroelectric construction and clearing transmission lines because I wanted to get paid for the activity of clearing, but really wanted my work tied to something that was important to society. So when you clear for a power line, that's a long-lasting thing that benefits many, many people. And also you're not tied to the economic value of a tree, which generally is influenced on what the lumber market says and what the mills are willing to pay. So that was eye-opening for me. And eventually I got caught up in deal making and managed to connect buyers and sellers off the side of my desk, and decided in 2015 that I would do that full time. So worked on what's called sell side M&A advisory. So particularly for resource companies, putting buyers and sellers together, advising families on transactions in the resource industry, sand and gravel, mining, forestry, of course, and things of that nature. Was recruited into a national accounting firm to do that, and particularly to work with people, mostly larger family enterprises that were heading for succession. So moving either the business from Gen 1 to Gen 2 or Gen 2 to Gen 3, or packaging, getting ready to sell, at which point I'd hand off to M&P's corporate finance department, or just working with people to get tax strategy involved so that they could maximize their exit and make sure that they were being well compensated, and set up the best for the best exit. And then by happenstance, we had a mutual friend named Jeremy Weeb, and he introduced Martin and I, and we started dreaming about what could be done differently in Canada's forests. And that birthed Carbonethic. Because of my involvement with the family forest license, I'd really looked at the different values of trees, recognizing there was some timber that was uneconomical for us to harvest. And could we do things differently? Could we find another source of economy that just wasn't tied to the value of a tree that a mill says it's worth, but could it be valued differently? So I looked at this thing called the carbon market that barely existed 30 years ago. In this case, about 24 years ago, I guess, because I probably did my heavy research in 2000, 2001. Really got an understanding of how the carbon market worked, and also recognized it was uneconomic because people weren't willing to pay excuse me, the cost to set trees aside to sequester carbon. Fast forward 20 years, and of course that dream became a reality. We stepped out and started building Carbonethic, and here we are today. 4 years into the process, and it's been a blast.
So thanks again, to sharing with all of us that extensive experience of yours, and setting actually the table for what we're going to discuss in the next few weeks. Our goal, our mission for the viewers is pretty simple. We want to educate people on what is the forest issues that we are facing, especially in Canada. So just to be clear, the company is based in British Columbia, and the forest industry is a very important industry for the British Columbia economy. And so there's a lot of things which needs to be done. But quickly today, Brent, so just to set the table, as said, last year, not only in BC, everywhere in Canada, and we can see the same issues happening in multiple different areas of the world. We had massive forest fires. And of course, there's no consensus in between scientists saying, oh, it's related to climate change, or it's related, to human behaviors and such and such. And this is not what I really want to discuss today with you. It's way more about the problem regarding the forest has been happening for a long time. It's nothing new, right? So I think one of the key that you can discuss about, it's the lack of forest management and how the forest grows even after a forest fire, and how can it be improved. So this is really the key. What happened for the last 50, 70 years of our forest, as here in Canada, the boreal forest, what happened and how can we make it differently?
Sure. So I think it comes down to a human versus the world problem. So I think oftentimes climate change, the environmental movement often thinks about that we're damaging the planet, but the planet in fact is quite resilient, and it's humans that aren't. So the planet will survive all of us because it's existed for a very long time, but we have to figure out a way to interact with the planet. So the Earth really doesn't care if it has a dirty air shed or not. Growth will come and go. The Earth has been historically hotter than this. The Earth has been historically cooler than this. We go through periods of change. It's more about, is this good for humanity? and can we interact with the planet in a way that it's beneficial for both sides of the equation. Planet will kind of take care of itself. When it's tired of humanity, it'll probably wipe us out, or at least that's my take on it. So we have to figure out how to coexist, and I think that's really what forest management is about. So if we go back to pre-industrialization or pre-civilization, forests could come and go, they could burn down, and it really wasn't an issue for humans. What's happened, obviously, with commercialization and in the industrialization of humanity, is a need for some type of forest management, because things are getting hotter, cycles are changing right now, and perhaps they'll cool again. We don't really know. Um, but the issue is our coexistence, and can we handle the amount of CO2 that goes into an air shed, because our forests are relatively unmanaged. So the challenge with Canada is that, we have nearly 400 million hectares of forest in some form or fashion, whether it's the very productive coastal forests in British Columbia, in the Fraser Valley, and the island and the North Coast where I live, right through to the interior plain and the inland temperate rainforest that we have, in the center of the province, or right north to the Boreal, and where it interfaces with the Cordillera that runs right across the top of the planet, through the Nordics and into Russia. It's a huge forest, and it's a huge responsibility. And what we've seen is that forest management has been built on the policy of extraction. So if we cut a forest down, it will go into a product, either pulp and paper or sawmill product or what have you. And then we will use quote unquote best practices, and those practices have changed over the years, to reestablish that forest. But it doesn't necessarily take the whole forest into context. And so when we start to have these large disturbance events like wildfire, there has to be a notion towards, can we manage the pieces that are perhaps less commercial, less viable, or things that we've just ignored, frankly, in deference to more productive forests. So mills come, mills go. Where we work in the boreal forest, there's been historical mills that have been there since the 70s and 80s, and then they closed down, and they were replaced by mills that came in the 80s and 90s and the 2000s, and then they closed down, and little sawmills would pop up, and they came and go, because there was no collective sort of understanding of what it takes to manage a forest at scale. And I think that's what we're facing now, is that the vast majority of the forest in Canada is unmanaged. And that's okay if you don't have to interface with it as a human. It's not okay if you do. And so things are getting hotter, and there's been no strategy, cohesive strategy, to deal with the heat that's coming and the damage that's existing in the forests. So I think that's a challenge. And until we admit that and start to redevelop forest policy at scale, it's going to be a challenge. And that means monetizing the forest differently, similar to what we do with Carbonethic, where we're able to say, okay, if this is actually a productive, healthy forest and it sequesters carbon, and we're able to set that aside and ensure that it's defended and improved, then can we have a financial incentive to do that work? And that's really what the carbon market has developed today, versus the industrial vision, which is there enough for me to build a mill, put some road infrastructure in, go and do large scale harvesting? And if there is there a market for that timber? And if there is it economically viable? And will it make my shareholders happy? And that's really the fight that we're in today, where the vision has really been for what makes sense on a balance sheet perspective versus what actually is good for the forest.
It made so much sense, right? And on the other end, these kind of concepts help actually some companies, to diversify their activities and get involved, actually privately or publicly, to get involved to support these improvements, which are needed, because at the end of the day, we've got bug infections traveling, in the forest. You have forest fires, and again, one of the goal of improving the forest, I guess, Brent, is to make sure that when there's either lightning or bad human behavior, which sparks a fire somewhere, The reality is that it takes an hour or two, and now we're burning, hundreds of thousands of hectares so fast because the forest is dry. And I'm pretty sure that we can find solution if we are financially supported, that we can attack the fire quicker and reduce actually the negative impact, because every single time we have a fire going on, it's a CO2 release back in the atmosphere, and these events are huge. So you're fighting for years trying to improve, and like one event can just bring back all of that pollution back into the air, right? And that's what we are working on.
Yeah, exactly right. If you think about it this way, there's something you can do virtually to every piece of forest across the planet that would enhance its ability to sequester carbon, that would protect it against wildfire. Not to say that you can prevent all wildfire, but there's things that you can do to make the fire burn past it quicker, to remove the fuel loading, i.e., stuff on the ground. You can add productivity to trees by thinning them out, by pruning them, taking off the lower branches, so it forces the tree to add bulk as opposed to spending its resources to make those lower hanging branches. Things of that nature, you could do that right across the planet. The problem is there's not enough money to do that, and there certainly isn't enough money to fight forest fires the way that we've been doing it. And so it comes down to prevention, and that's really what carbon projects are, is a wedge against forest fires, in that we have a vested interest to make this forest as healthy and productive as possible, but also taking into account what's natural. And so that's the flip side, is that you can overmanage a forest, and oftentimes fast growing plantation crops are just that. They're planted in jurisdictions that can rotate a crop in 8 to 12 years. So it's more like commercial farming of trees, as opposed to natural ecosystems that have resilience against wildfire, that have resilience against a spruce budworm or mountain pine beetle, or things of that nature that can come and affect a forest at scale. And so we want to mimic as best as possible what is natural, but also provide enhancements. And of course, the limitation is cost. So when you think about an average treatment of a forest, you can spend anywhere from $1 to $10,000 a hectare. And of course, if you multiply that out over 4 or 500 million hectares, there's just not enough money to do that on a sustained basis. So we really do need a change, not only in industry, but also to support more large scale projects like ours, that are setting that forest aside, that are building rapid attack resources. So when we do have a lightning strike, we can be out monitoring with a drone. We can radio back and have some rapid attack crew go and deal with that. And that's financed through the sale of carbon credits, not through the provincial government's wildfire budget, because they have a monumental task on their own. And they're great people doing good work, and well done firefighters are amazing, brave individuals who devote their summers, their springs and winters to training, and their summers to being in horrible conditions, staying in a tent, packing around a backpack and getting covered head to toe with smoke and putting themselves at risk. And we have fatalities every year, unfortunately, in the fire community, whether it's an accident, transportation, or people on the front line succumbing to smoke inhalation. And we've seen those tragedies, and they're going to become only more too common. So really, our strategy in effective forest management is not only prevention, but also the things that, when those disturbance events do occur, like a wildfire, we can get on it right away. When we start to see evidence of spruce budworm, we can actually get on that right away, as opposed to waiting for old policy to get around to making some decisions. And so that's the advantage of holistic forest management, is that we know what to do. It's the ability, the license to do those things, and then having some cash through the finance of carbon offset sales, to be able to address those things. And so in that sense, we can prevent those carbon bombs that you've talked about.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the other piece too that's kind of interesting to think about is that countries with our Paris Accord goals, we have a mandate to reduce our carbon footprint to a certain point. And so carbon offset projects are a pretty important point or part of that. But if you think about how much carbon intensity, how much CO2 gets emitted into the environment, into the airshed, that's a global airshed from Canada on an annual basis, and particularly last year where we lost, sort of 15 to 20 million hectares of
Yeah.
forest. We didn't have to account for that from a carbon perspective. And so it's an interesting loophole. And I don't think it's one that's necessarily going to stay open long term. So then it comes down to what would happen if Canada was responsible for the CO2 emissions from our wildfires. That would be a real challenge. And that's why what we're doing is so important.
Yeah, the old model, when you're talking about BC Forest Service being great people and such, they still have to run on a budget, and of course they have to pick their fight. And if they have to protect some local community, as we got it last year in West Kelowna, and they have to protect some communities, well, at that point, that's where they focus their fight. And when you have a massive forest fire happening up north when there's no population around, they kind of let it go because they have no other options. And this is where we can play a big role into it. The second thing, which in the next video is coming in the next few weeks, I also want to address with you all of the other sub benefits which can come actually by forest improvements programs, because at the end of the day we can turn all of these residues which are collected into biomass, and there's an increasing demand into low carbon fuels and all the other kind of programs which can be turned. We remove actually the dead trees, we remove the branches, everything which is in the way of these amazing beautiful trees, to keep on growing better, to capture more pollution,
Mm-hmm.
while we can turn actually these residues into another a secondary market which has demand. So I think it's important that we educate people regarding the needs of the forest. This is one of our goals. Brent, I want to thank you today actually for again sharing all of these experiences with us. It's pretty fundamental to us. And we'll see everyone for the next video next week. That will be on our LinkedIn page. Of course, it'll be on our YouTube channel. If you have any questions, you want to support our work, please connect. You have the email address right here on the screen at info@carbonethic.io. It will be a pleasure to meet with you guys. Brent, thanks again. Last word you want to add before we end the video today?
Yeah, I think our motto in the forest is always doing something different / better. And I think that's what it comes down to in this talk about sustainability, about forest management. If we can just be more thoughtful about our actions, whether that's full scale forest management or just something you adopt in your daily life, that's how we make a difference. And that's how we move this conversation forward. So thanks for having me.
Hey, thank you, Brent. So we'll see you next week. Thanks for sharing, guys, and have a great week. Bye.